welcome to everyone that has joined us far. Today we are discussing Grid 2.0, the grid impact of EV adoption and legislation on empowering South Africa's future. I will begin to introduce our panel today. In today's webinar, we have AmpControl, who is a charge and fleet energy management software company headquartered in New York, USA. We are also joined by GreenCape, that powers the green economy. It's the green economy again, facilitating research and communications in government and industry, headquartered in Cape Town, South Africa. And then we are joined with Aeversa, a CPO in commercial industry that provides hardware and software and is an infrastructure manager headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa. And to just introduce our speakers, from AmpControl, we have Joachim Ross, founder and CEO of AmpControl. Joachim is the founder and CEO of AmpControl, the leading AI-powered platform to optimize energy and operation of electric vehicles since 2019. Joachim has worked with charging networks, utilities, and fleet operators to reduce total geometry costs and ensure reliable operation and transitioning to EV vehicles. Priam from GreenCape, a senior analyst, specializing in sustainable mobility energy storage at GreenCape. He has a college nearby degree with offices in sustainable mobility. GreenCape was set up in 2010 as a green economy development agency to invest jobs and invest in green. Beyond you, Aeversa, who is the CEO of Aeversa, the industrial design and education, and worked in the logistics and manufacturing sectors. At present, reality is focused on the implementation of EV and management of Aeversa's charging infrastructure network.
All right. I'm going to move on to the rest of the agenda. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ruben. Much appreciated. I want to say thank you to Joachim and Priyan for joining us today on this call. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights specifically on the sectors that you guys work in. Okay, so I suppose the key sort of question for today is, what is a smart grid like 2.0? It's this catchphrase that you've been seeing in the media. What does it actually mean, and how does it relate to electric vehicle charging? So as the grids around the world changes onto having more solar, more wind, and more nuclear, more green sources of energy, there's this increased risk of the intermittent supply. You'll see that all over the media, and it is a quite hot topic to disprove the viability of green energy sources. Now, on the other side of the fence, you've got these large DC charging machines that uses a lot of electricity to charge into EVs at very intermittent time periods. And in between that, you have the grid that needs to try and manage all of this. Now, what Smart Grid 2.0 effectively means, it is the software system behind the grid that manages the flow of energy so that you don't sit with something like a grid collapse. How do we make use of intermittent energy supplies bolstered by stationary storage and transmitted through the grid without necessarily putting undue or unnecessary strain? Now, just as a kickoff point, I want to start off with a quick little poll. And that is to ask, how much electricity do you need to transfer the South African diesel fleet onto the grid? If we were to take all of the diesel vehicles and make them EV today, how much electricity would we require? I'm just going to start a poll quickly. And I want to ask the participants to please just try and give their sort of idea. You know, there's a lot of large vehicles. I mean, if you look at the N3, there's 3,000 trucks that run up and down that route on a daily basis. So how much electricity is required in order to do that? I'm just going to give a few seconds for that to sink in. Okay, some very interesting results come through already. Nice. So I'm going to run you guys through a bit of a high level calculation. And I'm a firm believer that if you can't understand the system at a glance, you will be lost in the detail. So we're not going to run into the detail today. I'm going to give it to you at a glance. And the first source that we're going to be looking at is a data set that is provided by Zapier, which tells us how much fuel, specifically diesel fuel in liters, in millions of liters that is, was used in South Africa per year on an annual basis. Now, the number that I want you to look at is this 12.907 billion. Okay. Now, there's three more numbers that I want to point to you, and that is the Zapier data set, which shows us how many vehicles are licensed in South Africa. Okay. And in 2023, we had a total number of 2.689 million LDVs, buckies, diesel panel vans. This is the type of vehicle class that would use diesel. The same with buses. Sorry, I see that this red block is on the wrong line. So with buses, it's 64,982. And with trucks, larger trucks above 12-ton level, you're going to sit at 392,000 vehicles on the South African roads. This is 2023 data. It was published in June 2024. The same with the data from Zapier. This was published in June 2024 for the year of 2023. So in essence, if you look at these two numbers, around about 28.75 to 35% of all registered vehicles use diesel, but that accounts for 58% of our total energy. So when we talk diesel in South Africa, we talk about the majority of liquid fuel sources that are being used. Now, how much electricity would it take to convert that? Now, you can go down the route of trying to analyze it in ways of the efficiency of the vehicles, but there's a better way to do it. And that is looking at the megajoules level. So if we take the 12.9 billion liters of fuel that was used, and we convert that to megajoules, because that enables us to then transition it onto electricity, we would take 38.29 megajoules per liter of diesel times the amount of diesel that was used. That gives us a very interesting number that there's not enough space on the screen for zeros. And then we take that very, very lengthy number and we times it by 10.56, which is the number of kilowatt hours per megajoule. And that gives us an even larger number that my screen can certainly not fit. The point is that that number gives us a kilowatt hour reading for the total amount of diesel that was consumed in the year of 2023 in the entire country. Important to note that does also include the use of generators and for large logistic trains. So this is a quite conservative figure. Now, to take this figure to a more usable number, we need to understand how do we transition that raw energy in the form of diesel into forward mobility in the form of an electric vehicle. And in order to do that, you need to take a little trick that a lot of people don't necessarily understand about EVs. That is the efficiency of an electric motor. So head to head, the efficiency difference between an internal combustion engine vehicle and a electric motor is somewhere in the region of 70 to 80% more efficient. Okay. So what does it mean? Well, it means that you need between 70 and 80% less energy to do the same amount of work. So effectively how the calculation then runs from there, that's point number 3, is we take the funny number with a lot of zeros, we work on 30%. So effectively saying that 30% of the total amount of energy that would have been required had it been diesel would now be required to run electric. And we divide that by a million in order to get to a usable number, which is in gigawatt hours. Now, the EIA is nice enough to tell us that in South Africa in the year of 2022, that the entire grid produced 4,850 gigawatt hours worth of electricity. works out to around about 26 gigawatt hours per hour in a full 24-hour day. So that fits perfectly into what 2022 to 2023, with a total ESCOM grid capacity of in the region of around about 32 to 34 gigawatt hours. So that effectively translates to 18% of the entire grid capacity would need to increase to power all of the diesel vehicles on electric. Now, that seems to be a number that's too good to be true, but you can go and research this on multiple other sources. And like I said, if you don't understand the high level numbers, you'll get lost in the detail. So why are people worried about the grid impact then? If we only need to increase our grid by less than 50% to run all the vehicles on electricity in the country, why is this a concern? Well, it comes down to the transformer size. Our grid in South Africa is not designed to run high-powered DC chargers. On most of the sites that we visit for most of our clients, we're sitting with a transformer size, a main transformer size for the building or for the facility, somewhere in the region of 300 to 1,000 kVA. To put that in perspective, that's between 2 and 5 high-power DC chargers in the region of 160 to 200 kilowatts. Now, that does come to certain caveats, because it depends on how much power the building itself consumes and so forth and so forth. So even though it's not a matter of total energy consumption, it is a matter of how do we supply the energy when the vehicle is needed. So it's not a kilowatt hours problem, it is a kilowatt problem. So with that being said, I'm going to show you a brief little graph that illustrates a live site and how a typical charge event might look. So at this specific facility, you're sitting with 350 kilowatts worth of grid supply. It's 350 slightly more than a 350 kVA transformer. Now, you can see as the chargers get used, you almost get to the limit of what the grid can actually viably feed it. And all of these troughs in between doesn't necessarily line up with any baseload that gets fed. So in order to manage this, we need software. So I would like to pass it over onto Joachim from AmpControl to give us a case study of a very interesting project in New York where this graph that I'm showing you right now is actually implemented. Specifically looking at something called DR events. Now, in South Africa, Joachim, that's not something that we have. And I'm hoping that you can maybe just try and highlight what a DR event is and how it works in New York. Would much appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Riando. Let me share some slides as well and go through this. Before I go on, can you guys hear me well? How's my sound?
Yeah, it's good. If you want to let us know in the chat if they can hear Joachim clearly.
Okay, perfect. And the slides are good to see as well. Perfect. So, hi everyone, and I'm really excited to be here. And Riando, thanks a lot for the invitation. As Riando mentioned, at AmpControl we build software solutions, hardware for optimizing energy and operation of electric vehicles. And specifically in New York, and that case study that Riando mentioned, we had several companies approaching us due to this problem. On the right side, you see a map of Manhattan and Brooklyn, Queens, a little bit of Long Island City, and their utilization of the transformers on the different levels. And you see a lot of red, a little bit of yellow, and some green and blue parts. What this essentially means is transformers of the New York grid are heavily utilized. This picture is a few years old, so it's not as accurate anymore. We can assume probably we have even more red now since there's more electrification going on. Now, this is not only a problem for large real estate companies when they build new high-rise buildings, etc., but it becomes a major issue for fleet operators, EV charging point operators planning to install charging station for electrification. since they would need to request upgrades of a grid, which can take a year, 2 years, 3 years. We have heard timelines that go even beyond that. And in some cases, utilities might even say, sorry, we can't do it. It's not feasible, or it's financially not possible to upgrade. The reason for this is EV charging requires a lot of power. A DC charger is maybe equivalent to 20, 30, 40 AC, like window AC units. So it's a lot of power on one single spot. If you install multiple of those DC chargers, you become a similar load to a big building, even though you just use a quite small space. And the second issue is that charging often leads to peak charging. That means sometimes you charge very fast, sometimes you charge very slow, but you have to build infrastructure for the fastest possible charging that you plan. Now, one of our customers approached us facing that challenge in New York. So Revel is today one of the largest EV operators in New York. They have very large charging hubs. They approached us many years back and asked, we want to build EV infrastructure. They hadn't had installed any site yet. The plan is to do this in New York City, in Brooklyn. We are facing challenges with utility rates, but also we are collaborating with utilities and trying to find solutions on how we can install charging sites. Their primary goal is to reduce their monthly operations costs so that they can make charging profitable, not only for their vehicles. They have a rideshare business where they have to charge their vehicles every single night, but also because they will offer and plan to offer the charging to the public and would like to offer a good rates for residents. So this was a problem statement that we got approached. And what we explained and at the end also simulated for them before even doing any operational changes. If you look at utility rates, demand charges, and beyond, you see the certain components, right? So over time of the day, your energy rate might change. So you might have some off-peak, mid-peak, on-peak prices, where your price per kilowatt hour can differ. So that's the orange line. And then you have potentially demand charges where the utility doesn't charge you only per kilowatt hour, but also charges for the peak demand, as I mentioned before. In addition, you might want to enroll in event-driven rates. That means you want to react to what a utility tells you. I will say a few words about this in a second. But this is a baseline of most EV operations. You have often an energy price. In many cases, not in all of the cases, but in many cases, you have demand charges. And in addition, you have signals from utilities where they might tell you, please reduce your power consumption for the next hour. Now, for many fleet operators and charging point operators, you have variability. We call this flexibility. That means the vehicle that plugs in at this moment might not need to charge right now at full power. It might be sufficient if a vehicle can charge in an hour or two and can delay the charging. And this is what we call optimized charging. That means we take into account the different prices, peak demand, and signals to then shift the charging, which is marked here in blue, the energy consumption, to a certain time. We might not allow to charge zero power. We might not allow to stop the charging entirely, since this might imply how the vehicle can restart. But we might be able to shift the majority of the power to a cheaper period. Now, these prices could be set, like there could be seasonal prices. They don't change. They're every day the same. There could be day ahead pricing. So they could come the day before and they could be different every single hour. The UK has this, for example, or there could be spot pricing that could change every hour depending on the energy market. Or they could be related to signals. That means utilities might tell Riando, Aeversa, hey, please, can you, if you now stop charging, you might get this incentive by stopping charging. which allows the grid operator to balance the power. So all of these mechanisms are not there to annoy the fleet operator or the charger point operator. They're there as a tool for utilities to balance power. They can shift power to a time when it's maybe where the utilization is less high. So in this case, maybe in the early mornings or very late evenings, when everyone goes to bed, grid utilization usually goes down. So you can make power and energy cheaper, and similar. So these are really the best tools to do this. And how companies like in New York have now done this over the last 3 years, they are now operating over 6 sites. We, in average, are able to save around about 45% of their monthly energy costs. Those savings come from avoiding peak demand charges, but also taking advantage of those time of use rates. So on the kilowatt and on the kilowatt hours. And you see an example here for one site, on the right side. And essentially it means for companies like Revel or fleet operators in this region, if you take advantage, if you optimize of those demand response events, that you can become much more profitable. You can reinvest much faster because you save money, so you can reinvest those capital, and you can electrify more vehicles at a time. For fleet operators, it essentially means you increase your margin. More importantly, for utilities, it means you can help companies to electrify and coordinate the grid and control it without directly controlling it. And just to finalize, those solutions can be very simple, but they can also be a little more complicated. But those things have been built over the last 10 years. So this is not anymore innovation projects or pilot projects. Those are essentially in the field. We have been operating this with Aeversa for many years now. In South Africa, we have operations in Latin America. And I can say that it doesn't matter how the utility at the end wants to control the grid, either directly, indirectly, through rates, through events. All of this has been done today, so it's definitely feasible. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for utilities, but also for fleet operators to continue electrifying. So with that, I give it back to Riando or to Priyan.
Thank you. Thank you, Joachim. I just have one quick question. So in Australia, they are earmarking the official legislation nationally for the integration of vehicle to grid by the end of this year. And I'm just quite curious, are you seeing companies on your network internationally that are making use of a vehicle to grid functionality at this stage? Or is it all still in the legislation phases where you guys are?
Good question. Thanks, Rihanna, for bringing it up. So I didn't actually talk about V2G. So vehicle to grid, just for everyone, the difference is for demand response events, you might respond to the utility and stop charging. For V2G, you also discharge potentially.
So just to make that quite clear, sorry, Joe, I just want to make sure that our attendees might be clear with what a V2G means. So it is short for vehicle to grid, and it means that when you plug your vehicle in, that you have the option to be able to discharge onto the grid. Sorry, Joe.
No, perfect. And we definitely see companies being very bullish on this technology. It is slightly newer than the normal charging technology because EV chargers are slightly different setup. But the benefit for that is for those vehicles that stay connected to the charger for a very long period, such as certain bus operations, school bus operations, but a lot of overnight fleets. They sometimes stay connected for 9 hours and they don't operate, but they don't need 9 hours to charge. They might only need 2 hours to charge, 3 hours to charge. So you have a flexibility of double of the time, at least, of what you're charging. So you can easily discharge the vehicle for a certain period. So it's definitely feasible. And we see more and more utilities using those V2G signals to, again, balance the grid, take advantage of potentially feeding back to the grid if more energy power is necessary in a certain region. And the more vehicles you have, the more interesting it becomes. When you have multiple megawatt hours being able to discharge in a very short period, that becomes very interesting for utilities. It's short-term storage in the grid. And again, where the vehicles stay quite long, such as buses, it becomes very, very interesting. And in the US, for example, all school bus operators are betting on V2G and doing V2G projects already today.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Joe. Much appreciated. And
Randy?
I'd like to move. Hi there.
Hi.
Can you hear
We
me?
have a question from Prakash. He's asked, while the charging can be planned at this stage to off-peak time slots, has any work been done in terms of evaluating how the mass adoption of EVs will cause a shift of peak demand?
That's a very, very good question. And I think that I can try and answer that with a case study that I'm willing to share after the call, by the way. So, Norbert, if you want to reach out to us after the call to get this data, I can share this with you. It's a specific data set that I read quite recently that ran over 5 different studies on 200,000 electric vehicles in Australia, where they looked at the various methods that they can influence how and when people charge their vehicles. Now, that is from the top down, with it being a hard and fast rule or a incentive-based system. So in short, what they found is that the incentive-based system actually showed very, very, very promising results. And to put that into like a rand and cents perspective, imagine charging your EV for around about 22 to 23 cents per kilowatt hour at after 10 to, I think it's 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and then being able to resell that electricity at around about 4 to 6 rand per kilowatt hour during peak time periods. So what they found is that a lot of the charging equation happens at home, right? So there's one big shift that happens with a electric vehicle, and that is that you don't necessarily have a diesel pump at your house, but you can have a charger, and you can have a V2G charger. So they are finding that a vehicle to grid is going to be a very nice incentive for vehicles sitting at home or vehicles sitting at large fleet depots to make a second gross revenue. And ultimately, the grid sees a very big benefit in that, because they are able to utilize a digital battery that they didn't necessarily have the expense to go and implement themselves, that is. I hope that answers your question. We are going to be having a more lengthy question and answer session at the end of this. I do want to quickly get through to Priyan so we can have at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the call. So Priyan, I'm really excited to hear from GreenCape's point of view. I know you guys have done some very interesting work with the city of Cape Town specifically, and I think that South Africa sits in a very interesting position where we have the ability to learn from the rest of the world, and being able to leverage off of systems like AmpControl that has international exposure. We have the ability to be able to make this link between the utility managers as well as the fleet owners and the charge point operators. I'm quite curious to hear from you from a legislation standpoint. Could you kind of try and highlight to us where we are sitting in South Africa?
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen quickly. Okay, yeah, so this is just a brief presentation and an overview of the work that GreenCape is currently doing with regards to developing an EV charging best practice guide. So this particular piece of work was requested by the city of Cape Town, but it really is a sort of a national project, and the concept that we're developing goes beyond Cape Town, and I think it's useful for all municipalities and all utilities in terms of planning EV charging infrastructure. We actually recently just had an industry event with the city of Cape Town where we invited other national stakeholders, national government departments, ESCOM, SANEDI, SABS, and NRCS, and other metros to try and get some perspectives of where the other cities are going with the EV charging projects. And what we found is that in terms of planning and forward planning, the city of Cape Town is a little bit ahead of the other metros in terms of thinking this through. And so I think over the next short to medium term, they are going to play a bit of a leading role in developing this EV charging best practice guide, but drawing input from the other stakeholders. And just as a starting point, what we did in the event is we invited Johnson Marema from the SABS. So that's the South African Bureau of Standards. And what he did was he started as a baseline just to explain what the current national standards are with regards to electric vehicles and EV charging, charger hardware and the charging stations. It was a really informative session. And what came out of that is across the country, there's very little awareness from municipalities and utilities around the fact that these standards do exist and that they are benchmarked against international best practice. So the current gap there is to do a bit of an awareness campaign to capacitate those decision makers, firstly, to be aware that they are internationally benchmarked standards, and then how do they implement the standards of those municipalities and utilities. And also the key point that came out of that workshop was there's a difference between standards and regulations, and people often mix up the two. So the standards, the SABS standards, are voluntary, regulations are compulsory, and regulations are the mandate of municipalities or utilities to roll out based on standards that are then made compulsory in the specification. And then also to differentiate between what is the NRCS and what is the NRS. So the NRCS is the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, and that sits under the DTIC, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And really that entity deals with standards and compulsory specifications for hardware. So from a manufacturer's perspective and standardizing that. And then you have the NRS, and that is an informal working group of entities from metros, municipalities, the Association of Municipal Utilities, AMU, ESCOM, and other relevant departments, and they develop and implement standards or compulsory standards and regulations from a municipal utility or a utility in ESCOM perspective point of view. So those are the two key role plays on the hardware side and on the covenant side. And what we eventually landed upon at the end of that workshop is these points here, which I'm going to go through quickly. So what are the national standards, SABS and NRCS, and how can they be implemented locally? What protocols, such as communication protocols, are required to be implemented so that utilities can have some form of load management or grid management control of the EV charging network? Should there be a requirement for chargers to be registered with the local utility or with ESCOM? How would municipalities and ESCOM implement metering required for EV charging infrastructure, and who would pay for the metering? This discussion is particularly important for the city of Cape Town. They were looking at how do we allow the private sector to install public EV charging stations on public land. So the question of curbside EV charging stations that you see in other countries, that would be on public land in a parking bay on a curbside. So that's the use case, an example, or some other municipal building parking areas where they could install on. So the city's main concern there is that they are wanting, if they allow this to happen, they want to install their own sort of electricity meter, even though the charge point operators have indicated that they have their own metering system that's included in the charger hardware. The city says that from their side, they want to be able to meter and monitor that consumption at that site on their own. So that was the other point that was raised. And then the other issue was controlling user charger behavior and how to implement time of use tariffs. So a lot of people have been asking about, should municipalities develop their own EV charging tariff and charge a special tariff for EV charging. I don't think it's going to be developed in that way. So not from an EV consumer perspective, but definitely from a consumption perspective and the time. So it's not that it's a EV tariff. It's a generic time of use tariff. But from what we've found, we're still a bit away from what implementing that. It's a bit of work to do there before that can happen. Some of the things that the city of Cape Town raised were they were wanting to understand how do they remotely load control the EV charging network in Cape Town, for example. And they wanted to understand, like, what is the role of the municipality in terms of mandate? How far should they intervene in terms of being able to load curtail in that manner across a network of public chargers? So there's two sort of ways that or mechanism that came out of that workshop. One was obviously having this communication protocol where the city could remotely tap into the public EV charging network and remotely load curtail in certain areas if there's strain on the grid. So that's a direct intervention. The second intervention is just being a network communicator, as in being able to communicate to the charge point operators or to the network operators to say that at particular points in time in certain areas, there is a high demand or stress on the grid in those areas. Can you please load curtail? So like giving an instruction to the charge point or network operator to the load curtail on their behalf. There was no real consensus from that meeting in terms of which of the two would be taken forward. But what we did gain from industry is understanding that a lot of the charge point operators like Gridcars and Rubicon, etc., who have a very large footprint, they do already have the hardware installed that's capable of remote load curtailment. So it's just a matter of agreeing on what's the best mechanism or way to do that. We did touch on V2G as well, so vehicle to grid. However, there was caution that we need to let the market lead on that discussion. And what we mean by that is market intelligence on how far OEM is with regards to rolling out V2G technology for the specific EV models. We know that one of the largest EV OEMs in the world, Tesla, hasn't rolled out V2G on all of their models. I think it's just a Cybertruck for now that I'm aware of. So it's important to also listen to the market and understand, are we developing something that the market is not ready yet for? We have engaged with Golden Arrow Bus Services, so the company that's rolling out 120 electric buses in Cape Town, on this question of V2G as well. It was thought that maybe they might be an interesting use case to feed back into the grid. And their perspective as a public transport bus operator was that if they do have excess charge or battery available in their fleet, they actually would like to keep it and not feed it back into the grid. So that was an interesting perspective to hear from a public transport operator, and they are sort of more concerned with their operational needs rather than grid balancing. But that might change over time. That's their perspective. So not to say that V2G won't ever happen. It's very early days.
I've got a question for you, Priyan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interject, but just on the topic of like V2G, as well as heading back onto registration of a charger, right? Some interesting insights that we actually are seeing in Australia is that the local councils have now mandated it that all household chargers need to be registered with council. And the adoption that they have found with that is absolutely terrible, because what they have found is that the installers that are responsible for the installation of these units don't necessarily want to do the registration, because the clients, on the other hand, don't want the council to have a say on when they can charge the vehicle or can't. What is interesting, though, is that, and this kind of ties onto the V2G discussion, is that when you incentivize a charge point owner with a let's call it a preferential tariff, so you can charge your vehicle for cheaper if you register your home charger or your public charger. That might change the perspective of a fleet owner like Golden Arrow, if they can say, for instance, discharge at 4 to 6 rand a kilowatt hour middle winter, just an interesting thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. I think that perspective will change as Golden Arrow increases the electrification of their fleet. I think with the current penetration, it doesn't really make sense. But once they have a fleet scale electric bus fleet, so if they have 1,100 electric buses, then the scenario changes rather drastically. We do know they have the operational peaks, right? So they only really operate in the morning and the afternoon. So there's a large portion during the day and at night when the buses really are just parked at depots, and so they could feedback during that time. But as of now, that was the feedback that we got from Golden Arrow on that.
That is absolutely
yeah,
everything.
yeah, no, the city of Cape Town is very keen, in theory, for all consumers, even households, to sort of register the EV chargers. And I think you are right. I think that V2G aspect is going to become very important for that registration to happen. And possibly it will just follow the SSEG registration framework that currently happens with household solar PV registration. But I don't think it's going to be something that's going to happen very soon. So I think there's maybe a year or 2 years away from something like that. I think for now the city is just collecting data and information to understand what are the possibilities of what they could do. All right, so that was just the one slide.
Just whilst
And
you're
then-
going on to the next part of your presentation, I just want to ask our viewers to please use the Q&A to start putting in some questions. If you have any questions, start to post them there. And then as soon as Priyan finishes, we can start to run through that. We've got around about 10 to 15 minutes left on the call. Happy to stay on longer to run through the questions, but also feel free to drop off if you don't have the time. Sorry, Priyan, the floor is yours.
Cool. Yeah, no, I'm going to be quick because the next few slides are just an overview. So you did ask for an overview of what's the current legislative, policy, regulatory, and standards landscape. And I think this table is just to sort of help communicate what is the difference between these four things and where the mandate sits for each of them and whether it's legally binding or not. So the legislation is often a broad scope. It's something that is legally binding. It's an act of parliament that's often passed. A policy is normally done by a national line department. So that is a strategy. It provides direction for the industry. It's normally not legally binding, but a target. So something relevant to EVs is like the National Department's Transport's green transport strategy, which is being updated with the net zero target for 2050. So that's sort of like a soft push for decarbonization in the transport sector and a move towards EVs by 2050. Something on a municipal level in that sector would be the City of Cape Town's energy strategy. So they, as a city, they've taken a policy direction to also set a net zero target for 2050. And then there are regulations. So regulations are the ones that are binding, and often regulations are based on standards. So I mentioned before that standards, national standards in South Africa from a hardware perspective are published by the SABS. From a utility perspective, the NRS, the National Rationalized Specifications Association, generally publishes that. Some examples of regulators in the country are the NRCS, I mentioned before, from a hardware perspective. There's a new National Transport Economic Regulator of South Africa, NDOT. There's NASA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. So they would influence sort of decisions on regulation of electricity resale, pricing, and then at a municipal level, regulation in the form of time of use tariffs. So that's a quick overview there. This particular body I thought is useful to put on a slide because not many people know that they exist. But they play a really, really important role with regards to governance and regulation of governance from a utility perspective. And so the NRS is an unincorporated voluntary nonprofit association covering members from the 8 metros in South Africa, municipal utilities, the Association of Municipal Electricity Utilities, that's AMU, SABS, and NERSA. On that. And then Trianda asked me to just go through some of the existing SABS standards that do exist. So there's a secondary lithium-ion cells standard. There's a vehicle to grid V2G communication interface standard. There's information exchange for EV charging and roaming services standard. There's a plug socket outlets, vehicle connectors, and vehicle inlets. Conductive charging of electric vehicles standards. Remember, these are all voluntary standards, but it is important to note for the South African market, there's no sort of regulation enforcing this. The industry has agreed around Type 2 or CCS2 as a charging standard, and private sector is sort of adopting a unified approach, but there is no regulation forcing that. There's a communication networks and systems for power utility automation, and there's the EV wireless power transfer system standard. So yeah, that's just a basic, quick, high-level overview that I wanted to provide today. But happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic, thank you for that, Brian. Much appreciated. And it is clear to me that there's a lot of work that's happened in this space over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. If I can just speak for Aeversa, when we imported the first electric truck into the country in 2021, there was very little talk in the town, especially in the legislation space, about how we're going to manage the integration of electric vehicle chargers. So it's really great to see that there's a lot of standards coming into play. And if there are any fleet owners on the call today, it is just once again a clear illustration why it is important to choose your charge partner responsibly to make sure that you can comply to these standards. I know the standards that you are referring to here, and it's interesting to see how much of the learnings on these standards are coming from the international sphere. Like something as simple as just the charge point operator, the charge point standard. I'm really glad to see that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in this space in South Africa that will cause like further adoption delays. Thank you for that input. I just want to run through to the question and answer session. I see there's been a couple of very interesting questions thus far. I'm just going to start at the bottom, work my way up. Will the requirements for EV charging control not require grid upgrade to smarter grid infrastructure to allow for control and load management by utilities? 100% yes. So it's not necessarily as complicated as one might think, because ultimately the grid is already managed at this point in time, right? What is the tricky part is to make sure that we integrate the grid management onto the management of the charges. So charge point operators like ourselves integrating with councils, with the local municipalities in order to ensure that we abide by local bylaws and legislation. That goes on to the back of what I mentioned a little bit earlier. The link and the adoption of that can be fast-tracked if there is the integration or the adoption of a EV tariff, a EV preferential tariff that can help the buy-in of the registration of charge points and ultimately in the future helping with vehicle-to-grid functionality. I just want to check, is there anything that you would like to add onto that point? Joachim?
Yeah. I think the grid is already being transitioned into something smarter. So the grid is already operated in a very smart way. The goal is to, as we said, integrating the EV charging into this. We've seen in the US that most programs from utilities who also control incentives and grants very often. They often distribute money to the grid users, often require those registration that you mentioned before. So we see most EV chargers being registered. There's monthly reports, there are quarterly reports, and sometimes there are direct real-time integrations required. All of this is running through standards, so it's not very complicated. You have to set it up once and then it's running.
Fantastic, thank you. And on your side, Priya?
From what we've heard from the charge point operators, they already have a hardware installed that's capable of remote load curtailment. So I think from a hardware perspective, there's not too much of a difference that's needed. Definitely there is an upgrade from a grid capacity point of view. Like even just looking at one fleet, like Golden Arrow bus services, they're concentrating the electric bus charging at the depots. They're not going to have en route charging that we've seen in other countries, because it's concentrated at particular depots at such a high volume during certain parts of the day. They are gonna, or they have already requested significant grid upgrades. City of Cape Town on the short, medium, and long term. Some of the depots are also on ESCOM distribution grids, so like that's a further complicated matter in terms of upgrades at a city level mandate, at a national ESCOM level mandate. Yeah, the city is also asking or trying to engage with GABs to understand if they could stagger the electric bus charging from a management perspective. So trying to not let all of those buses charge at the same time, and also to see if some of the city's public transport interchanges, the city-owned infrastructure for public transport, whether the city could develop some EV charging infrastructure that might be able to be shared by the private cabs and the public MyCity bus to sort of like distribute that charging demand. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks for that input. And I can vouch for the intelligence inside of the electric vehicle chargers, as long as you are compliant to the OCPP 1.6, like going on to 2 standard. It's relatively easy to manage those units, and I think it's important for us to then reach out to the City of Cape Town as well as the Golden Arrow group with the software systems like AmpControl that can do exactly what it is that you are describing there. I'm going to go to the last question here. Second last question. What is your opinion on the use of microgrids to support load balancing and assisting with grid stability? This will include both renewable installations as well as EVs working together. That's a very good question, and we are going live with the first installation of that nature in South Africa this year. As Aeversa, we have partnered up with Takealot to install quite a sizable installation of both stationary storage as well as solar that will be providing between 60 and 70% of that localized fleet's total energy demands, and that's with a fleet running between 300 or 400 kilometers per vehicle over 10 vehicles. So it is the first sort of phase for a project like that in South Africa. We are seeing it working very well across the logistics sector. Exactly how it works for every fleet is a little bit different. And we are also talking to various property developers to understand how do we localize the storage and manage the distribution amongst various vendors, which I think would also definitely assist in this regard. I hope that answers that question. Is there anything that you guys would like to add there? Joe, Brian?
Yeah, we actually see, especially for truck operators, that microgrids, battery installation, solar installation become really crucial. They give additional backup power, they give additional redundancy, but they also accelerate electrification for some companies. Those projects are really, really interesting, and I think Aeversa has a really interesting project now coming up with those integrations that, especially for South Africa, give a lot of opportunities to combine solar, EV charging, and batteries. So I think that's becoming more and more the norm, not for every customer, but for many fleet operators, certainly.
Interesting. Brian, on your side?
Yeah, no, just a closing comment from my side. I think this topic of microgrids for EV charging is becoming popular. I think from a technical perspective, there's nothing wrong with the technology. I think it does what it's supposed to do. I think the major concern from the industry is the cost of it, and is it going to be commercially viable for fleet operators to be able to pay for it? Is a better question. But again, we'll only know that from the market. So I don't know if you have any insights on that.
That is a very interesting comment, and I can deliver some insight on it, where the solar and the storage installations on the right sort of use case not only makes sense, but it makes more than just sense. We're sitting in a very interesting time in the history of the logistics sector, where we have the ability to be able to gain some level of sovereignty over our source energy. And with some of our clients that have just gone down the route of solar, not necessarily storage yet, they're getting half up to 60% of their total energy consistently from not only a renewable source, but from a source of energy that they themselves own. And I think that's quite a profound shift in this realm. I hope that answers your question there, Prakash. Some very interesting questions, and I'm really enjoying diving into them. I'm going to go to the last question before we close out the session. We've got around about 7 or 8 minutes left. What is your experience with regards to higher power capacity requirements for large EV charging stations installations? Are the required upgrades coming in at a reasonable pace? Well, at this stage, the pace of EV adoption in the country is still very, very slow. In doing the research for this webinar, I happened to come across the latest data for sales of new energy vehicles into South Africa, and it's still incredibly low, with a total number of electric vehicles somewhere in the region of the low 4,000 sitting at the moment for registrations in the 2023 year. That is set to, I'm speaking of a correction, if not double, but substantially increase this year. But before we're sitting with these large-scale growth problems, we still need to mainly get around the issue of vehicle availability in the country. There's not enough EVs in the country for fleets or consumers to really choose from at price points that make sense. And there's various reasons for that we can delve into later. But to get to a point specifically about high power charging capacity, so think of your grid feed as your hose pipe in your garden, and your DC charger as a really big tap that's much bigger than your hose pipe. What you need in between those two things is a dam, and that's where battery stationary storage comes in, or BESS. And both in Cape Town as well as in Joburg, this was a very interesting expo that took place over the course of the last year or two, which is the Solar and New Energy Expo. And at both of these expos, there was the large-scale display of modular, small scale, somewhere in the region of 200 up to 300 kilowatt up to 600 kilowatt hour stationary storage batteries that specifically focused around addressing the use case of high-powered DC fast chargers, as well as the supply or the balancing of behind the transformer grid installations. So from a technical point of view, it is possible. We are able to implement, with the reduction in the cost of stationary storage, we're able to implement that viably in South Africa at the moment. And like I said, the first pilot project, well, not necessarily a pilot project, the first implementation project is going live at the end of this year. And I keep your eyes peeled for some media, publications, January, February next year with the first initial data. We're very excited for that. I hope that answers your question. And I'm going to pass the floor to Joe on your side. I've got a very specific question for you, Joe. It relates to the question that was asked there. At the Port of California, I know that they are running some megawatt chargers. And I believe that you guys have had some exposure or involvement in that specific project. Would you know if they are running some large stationary storage behind those chargers?
Yeah, so we actually just looked at the data for the last 6 months, and we had around about 10 to 15,000 charging sessions for drayage trucks. So it's a pretty big operation. These are two different customers. In total, we have around about 7-8 sites, and one of them have already batteries and solar on site. They're currently being connected. The others don't yet have battery and solar, but are considering having battery and solar. The one that has already battery and solar installed is the biggest one. They will take advantage of, obviously, of the Californian sun, which is quite constant. unused battery to overcome like night charging and so on. So they're doing this to increase the grid capacity even faster without waiting for upgrades. So definitely something that's happening. Since the battery prices are dropping, it's going to happen more and more. It's going to happen in the US, it's going to happen in Europe, in the Netherlands, etc., and in South Africa as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, man. Brian, I've got a very specific, like to this point, I've got a very specific question, and maybe we will close off with this on the session. As far as the city of Cape Town goes, have they discussed or looked at the installation of large scale storage behind the chargers in order to get around this all at once demand issue?
So I think it's important to understand that the city of Cape Town and how they see themselves in the EV charging ecosystem is not to be directly involved in the installation of stations. So it wouldn't be something that the city would decide on. They want to create an enabling environment for private sector charge point operators to be able to do this. So I think a better question, are private charge point operators in Cape Town looking to put behind the meter battery storage is a question. The only ones that I've seen that are doing this are the Rubicon Audi fast DC stations that come with battery storage. I don't know if you've seen those. In the pedestal of the charger, it includes battery storage. And in my discussions with them, they are rolling those out in particularly at fuel stations along freeways in areas where there is poor grid capacity there. And essentially what that means is they're able to roll out fast DC charging stations even though there is poor grid capacity there without needing to do the upgrade, because essentially the battery inside the charger charges through slow trickle charging, and then when the EV comes in, it's fast DC from that battery. So it's like a DC and DC charging that's happening there. I know a lot of private customers will probably have power walls or some kind of battery storage at their houses. So that is probably going to continue to happen, but that's within the ecosystem of the household where that battery backup will be used for other things as well, not just for EV charging. I know Tesla recommends that if you are going to have an EV charging at your house, that you do have a Tesla Powerwall or some battery pack that the EV is connected to, and they recommend not directly connecting up to the household grid. So that residential market for battery backup is always going to be there. I haven't seen any sort of like large scale battery installations for like fleet level EV charging, but maybe you have more insight there. What's happening in the freight and logistics sector, which is probably where the need might arise.
100%. I mean, like some of the projects that we are looking at for 2026 is very large batteries. I mean, we're talking about megawatt hours and massive charging stations, especially in the mining sectors. But I think it's time to call an end to this webinar. I really appreciate your time, Joe. I really appreciate your time on that side, Priyan. And I hope that the viewers found the information that we shared informative.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Same.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. We will be emailing all the attendees with slides and the recording of the webinar very shortly. I hope you guys join us again soon. Keep an eye on for webinars.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.